They flooded the economy with money. They printed all this money and sent it out to everybody. So what happened? We increased demand while we were decreasing supply. That's why you're seeing this huge increase in consumer prices right now.
Yesterday's speech, Powell says the U.S. banking system is sound and resilient. Well, what do you think?
Well, it's not sound at all. It is a house of cards that is starting to collapse. And the reason that the banking system is so unsound is really twofold. One, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates at zero for over a decade, basically. And during that time, banks loaded up on low yielding, long duration treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. They did this because they couldn't get any yield on short-term instruments, so they went out on the yield curve. But the reason they were able to take so much risk is because the government guarantees the bank accounts. And so the customers of the banks really didn't care what the banks did with their money, because they were confident that if anything went wrong, the government would bail them out. That was the moral hazard that everybody learned from the 2008 financial crisis.
They all said that if we went off the gold standard, the price of gold, which was about $35 an ounce at the time, they said the price of gold would fall. They thought the dollar was supporting gold instead of the other way around. So they were talking about how great the economy was going to be if we can only remove the shackles of the gold standard. And my father was the only one who testified and got it right, because he laid out exactly what was going to happen in the 1970s, the exact opposite of what the Secretary of the Treasury and the Federal Reserve said. They have no idea the damage that they have unleashed from their policies, especially the mistakes that they've made since COVID. I mean, the Federal Reserve has done everything wrong.
Well, I think Powell continues to, whether it's delusional or just wishful thinking or, just propaganda from the Fed, but he's in denial of the tremendous problem that the U.S. economy is in, and probably because the Fed is one of the main reasons that we're in this situation. But there's really no way out, because the Fed for the last decade or so has flooded the economy with inflation. I mean, inflation has been the deliberate policy goal of the Fed. The Fed has tried to bail us out of every other problem by creating inflation. And inflation showed up in the stock market, in the real estate market, and nobody really had a problem with it because people thought they were richer. But now the inflation has moved into consumer goods, and that's where it's going to stay. And consumer prices are headed much, much higher. And the rate hikes that we've seen thus far are too little too late to make a difference. The Fed is way behind the curve when it comes to quantitative tightening. They've barely shrank the balance sheet. It needs to shrink a lot more. But the problem is the economy is now so levered up based on the fact that the Fed left rates so low for so long that you can't restore normal rates, let alone the restrictive type of rates that would be needed to rein in the inflation, without creating a financial crisis that's on an order of magnitude greater than what we had in 2008, except we can't have any bailouts. So we have to allow the collapse to happen, which we didn't do in 2008. So it means stock crash, real estate crashes, bond crashes. We have a lot of companies going bankrupt. We have government slashing spending and defaulting on a lot of commitments, like paying benefits to people, Social Security, Medicare. A lot of commitments have been made by the government that it can't keep, especially if the Fed is committed to reducing inflation. And that's why this financial crisis, and everybody is reluctant to label it a financial crisis, but it is much worse than the one that we had in 2008, because thanks to the mistakes that the Fed has made since that crisis, we have a much bigger bubble now. The Fed caused the bubble that led to the financial crisis of 2008, and then they inflated a bigger bubble to try to paper over those mistakes and kick the can down the road so that we wouldn't have to deal with the full consequences of resolving all those mistakes. And of course, we just compounded the problem
with bigger mistakes, and now the U.S. economy is poised on the biggest economic disaster in its history.
The Fed is going to make a trade-off. I mean, because in order to get rid of inflation, we're going to have not just a recession, but a depression. We're going to have a financial crisis. There's going to be a lot of losses, and there's going to be no bailouts. And in fact, the U.S. government is going to be forced to slash spending on Social Security, Medicare. Since all these things are politically non-viable, I think the Federal Reserve is going to make the choice that inflation is the lesser evil, and that as much as it doesn't like inflation, it likes the alternative even less. And so inflation is just going to be a way of life. It's going to be high, and Americans are just going to have to deal with it. If you're working, you should go out and buy all the things you're going to need in the next several years. And as long as they're non-perishable, just buy them now, because the prices are just going to go up. So you might as well buy it now. Don't save, because your savings are just going to erode away in value as the price of everything you need to buy goes up.
Well, the banks that were too big to fail are much bigger now, and they're even more insolvent. You know, the Fed never really stress tested what was going to happen. They just assumed that stagflation was impossible, so they didn't bother to test for it. But the economic event that the banks can't handle is a big decline in the economy coupled with a rise in inflation. So if we have high inflation and recession at the same time, the banks are going to fail. And the problem is the public is going to want to withdraw its money from these banks, because the banks are not going to be able to pay an interest rate anywhere near enough to compensate for the continued erosion of the value of their deposits through inflation. And of course, when people want to get their money out of the banks, the money isn't there. It's been lost. You know, it's tied up in underwater mortgages. And so the only way that people can get their money is if the Fed prints it. But when the Fed prints it, it just destroys even more of the value. And so it accelerates the momentum for a spiraling inflation.
But if you look objectively at the data, the savings rate is at the lowest it's been since 2007. I think it's down to 2.3%. So Americans have blown through all their stimulus money, and now they're pretty much broke. If you look at credit card debt, it's at an all-time record high. So Americans are struggling to put food on the table and to pay the electric bill, and so they're borrowing more money on their credit cards. If you look at what's happening to wages, they are declining in real terms. And I think the real decline is being masked by the fact that we are understating inflation.